You're watching World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. A fresh wave of missile attacks, on Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin approving changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine and threats to Poland over a new American missile defense base. Those have been just some of the developments out of Russia in recent days. So, what does this mean for the region at large? And are they a reason to worry? Joining me now is John Hardie, Deputy Director for the Russia Programme at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Joshua Burgin, Foreign Policy Expert at the Warsaw Security Forum. Good evening, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us with us this evening.
Now, can I start with you, Mr. Hardie? Where do things go from here? I mean, do these moves by Mr. Putin, especially the talk about launching an intercontinental ballistic missile, do these signal an escalation of the war, a high-stakes moment?
Well, Putin certainly hopes that this new missile test in Ukraine will strike fear into the heart of Kyiv's Western supporters. And from my perspective, I don't think we should fall for that trap. I think Putin's threats are mostly bluster. And I think Russia is actually less likely to use nuclear weapons at this point in the war than it was at certain points prior in the war. I think even then, the likelihood of nuclear use was rather low.
Mr. Burgin, I want to ask you about what difference you think the US approving the use of long-range missiles would mean for the conflict. Do you think it could just end up making Russia retaliate further?
Well, I think it should have happened a long time ago. The current administration's reluctance to engage more directly to create threat for Russia. Everybody seems to cower in the West. Oh, what is Russia going to do? What is Russia going to do? But if you look between the United States and the EU economies, approximately $40 trillion. Russia has a $2 trillion economy. They use threat and bluster, and the West sort of cowers in fear. It is long overdue, and I don't think that any of this repercussions, even as we've seen, it's a lot of noise and not a lot of substance.
So to your point, do you feel like the West has been running scared from Russia's threats?
Running scared, just general reluctance, some idea that we can negotiate or sort of treat the Russians in the same way that the West would negotiate. This idea of I'm okay, you're okay, or mutually beneficial. It simply doesn't work that way. Russia's zero sum. You negotiate with them when they're on their heels, not by looking them straight in the eyes and shaking hands. It's unfortunate that many of our Western leaders don't see it that way. They're trying to behave as gentlemen in the European and American sense, and the Russians just simply don't view these things through the same frame of reference.
Mr. Hardie, is Vladimir Putin someone who will ever retreat, will ever give in, or does this war have to end with some kind of concession of land on the part of Ukraine?
So if I'm President-elect Donald Trump, right now I should be thinking about ways to, as my colleague said, put the Russians back on their heels, ways to increase the leverage of Ukraine and the United States, and to pressure Putin so that he's more likely to reach a peace agreement that is acceptable and long-lasting. I think the nightmare scenario is we reach some sort of temporary deal that might pause the conflict but leave Ukraine vulnerable to future aggression. And I think a follow-on war, unfortunately, there's a good chance that will happen. After all, the current conflict is a follow-on war to the 2014-2015 war, and dominating Ukraine is a fundamental obsession of Vladimir Putin's, and I don't think he's going to abandon that anytime soon.
So how do you ensure that Russia is, in both of your words, back on their heels? And how do you ensure that this war doesn't start again in a couple of years if it were to come to some form of a conclusion or a stop, at least for the time being, under Donald Trump? Mr. Hardie.
I think one thing President Biden in his remaining time in office and President Trump can do is provide more long-range missiles to Ukraine, things like JASM, for example. President Trump could push Republicans in Congress to pass a new large Ukraine assistance package called a Ukraine leverage package. I think we can kind of tighten the sanctions regime on Russia, for example, by targeting the so-called shadow fleet that ferries Russian oil around the world.
Mr. Burgin, speaking of the US, good foreign policy is often regarded as consistent, predictable, sometimes even boring. Donald Trump very openly talks about his approach being completely opposite. But is it possible that he could be the one to broker peace?
Well, I certainly think it's possible. For months now, I've had numerous colleagues sort of in panic mode saying if Donald Trump wins re-election, then Ukraine is lost. And I have profoundly disagreed from the start. We know that the president-elect has an enormous ego. We know that he sort of is more comfortable going toe-to-toe with a Putin. And the notion that the small man of Russia, and I'm sorry to say it that way, but it's true, he's physically small, he's presiding over a small economy and a significantly diminished military force. The idea that the president-elect could be bettered by him on the world stage, I think is laughable. To that end, I agree with my colleague, the president-elect and his team should be absolutely strengthening Ukraine's position, even if they are looking to negotiate a settlement. And, that's putting more weapons on the ground. That's putting a range of weapons, not just precision long-range strike weapons, but that's animating that society in a way to where it can be fortified for many, many months, if not years to come. And it's about putting Ukraine and, in fact, the Western world, including NATO, the United States, in a footing to where negotiations are from a strong position as opposed to we simply want this done, time to move on. I would advocate for being as animated and as aggressive as possible with Russia, but not trying to push them over an edge, but simply saying you will not win this. And every effort that Russia engages in to saber rattle with nuclear, I think that the Western world should, with locked arms, saying, try it. It will not end well for you.
You mentioned Donald Trump's ego there. I mean, he enjoys being cozy with the likes of Vladimir Putin, and he also has talked about himself, and others have commented on his negotiating style as being transactional. Where do you feel like Donald Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin goes in the context of this Ukraine war, and does a transactional approach, does this work in a situation like this?
Well, there's certainly Donald Trump is not, as many people have prognosticated, the notion that he's sort of chummy with. They're competitors. Let's not forget that. I suspect that he may negotiate, or Putin may negotiate more along his style. Trump is not one of these sort of large, collaborative, let's sit down and all reach consensus. He wants to lead. He wants to get to conclusion and be quick. That said, again, I just can't imagine that he's going to take a secondary position to Putin. So, if he negotiates in that sort of transactional way, is that a departure from the past? Of course. But I also don't think this sort of excessive collaboration, everybody has a veto, has particularly served us well in the last months. And, it is good to have, in my view, it will probably be a change of posture and perhaps good for this new approach. I actually, like I said, I'm not deeply worried. Am I concerned? Yes, but am I worried that Trump is going to immediately roll to Putin? Absolutely not. His credibility is at stake.
Mr. Hardie, I'd like to come to you on that point as well. How do you think that the region will be able to navigate a Donald Trump presidency? And again, do you feel like he's someone who could actually bring peace to Ukraine in some way, shape or form?
It'll be very tough, I think, to secure a good peace agreement, particularly now that Putin thinks he holds the cards in Ukraine. I think that task number one is to help Ukraine stabilize their lines, and if they can do that, then and we can convince Putin that he's not going to win through military force. I think the likelihood of reaching a fair and lasting deal will increase. I think if you're European capitals, America's NATO allies in Europe, and you're not already meeting your commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense, I think you should probably do that in very quickly, in a hurry. Looking at Germany, including Canada, by the way, over here in North America. I think that President Trump, and during his first term and since then, has been quite clear that he has very little patience for allies who don't meet those type of commitments. And so I hope our leaders in Europe will sort of right this ship very quickly.
And just very briefly on a couple of other issues. First to you, Mr. Hardie, on the changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine. The word nuclear, quite rightly, is always treated with alarm, but how deeply should we read into this move?
I think it's important to remember what this new document is. It's declaratory policy, meaning that in this document, the Russians have somewhat expanded the circumstances under which they say they might use nuclear weapons. When Putin, if and when he decides to use nukes, he's not going to like pull the document and say, oh, well, it's here, so therefore I can use nuclear weapons, right? He's going to make these decisions, in part based on the options presented by his military advisors. But I think if you look at times earlier in this war where, the nuclear specter was raised, for example, during the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive, Putin did not use nuclear weapons then. He did not use them when Ukraine invaded the Kursk region in Russia, right? So I think those are scenarios where, in my opinion, Russia would be more likely to use nukes, though still probably unlikely on an absolute scale, but they didn't. So I don't see it as likely now that Ukraine has this permission to strike in Russia with Western missiles.
And Mr. Burgin, very lastly, we're running out of time, but I'd like to end with the comments of Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk today, who noted that, quote, a global conflict is serious and real and the war in Ukraine is in a decisive stage. Is he right?
I have watched with admiration as the Prime Minister has worked to assemble a collection of European leaders to stand up resistance to Russia on European terms. I think this is part of what this administration, the administration-elect and previous administrations have been calling for decades. And to that end, the notion that there's a very real threat on the doorstep, I admire the Prime Minister for his efforts and encourage him to continue down that path. Couldn't be more supportive on this end.
John Hardie, Deputy Director for the Russia Programme at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Joshua Burgin, Foreign Policy Expert at the Warsaw Security Forum. Thank you both very much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
And that's this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. Do stay with us and you can check all the latest headlines out at tvpworld.com. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.